when the red light goes on, basically. And then you can select switch back to the other Word doc.
All right, we're on.
Yeah. Take it away.
Running.
Yeah.
Cool. So, where do we find out if people are here in there?
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. So I'm currently talking to myself.
Yeah.
All right. G'day, everyone. Welcome to our second Facebook Live series that's being conducted by us here at Health in Balance. The first one was obviously on sleep that Tom and Dan took you through, and I'm sure you all got a lot out of those three Facebook Lives there. So this is going to be a 3-part Facebook Live series with the topic being stress. Dan's just popped his head in, so hello Dan, wherever you are. So stress is obviously something that impacts us all in different ways, especially with everything happening in the world at the moment. It's a pretty uncertain and stressful kind of time for a lot of people. So we thought it was appropriate that we touch on stress and all the different types of stress and obviously what we can do to manage it ourselves. So no one's immune to it at all. To give a small example, my brother plays sport, and I've seen him very stressed to the point of nearly being ill before things like big games. And then on the other end of the spectrum, my dad gets very stressed around his work and that kind of thing sometimes. So they have to do different things to manage their stress during those times.
Yep.
So today, I suppose the main thing that we're going to be talking about is like the different types of stress, why it's important. It's actually something that can help us. It's a safety mechanism for the body, I suppose. We're going to go over the acute stress, chronic stress, and I suppose the effects that chronic stress can have on our body as well. So there's lots of them, and we've got a fair bit of content to get through. So yeah, we'll fire away over to Tom.
Yeah. So before we probably need to explain what stress is and what's happening in the body when we get stressed before we dive into anything else. So it's important to know that stress is a natural sort of ingrained response that the body has. It's part of the evolutionary, adaptations to being human, and it's in a way a protective mechanism. So the sort of classic example that we give of people being stressed is if you think back thousands of years ago, first humans walking through the jungle, and the stress response is a survival mechanism. If they are the prey and someone is trying to catch them, kill them, whatever, the stress response needs to kick in to provide the energy or mental acuity to be able to survive, essentially. So it's a survival mechanism. And obviously those exact situations aren't happening in today's day and age, but the stress response for the body is still quite similar. And even though it's happening in different situations, what's happening internally is quite similar as well. So it's the body's way of protecting you, help you stay focused, stay alert, energetic, provide energy in different pathways, and potentially save your life in emergency situations as well. So for example, having to slam on the brakes in your car, prevent injuries and things like that. And all these responses happen quite quickly to sort of acute stress situations, which we're going to touch on in just a moment. And then there's the other side of the coin where we've got chronic stress, where these responses that should be happening over short periods of time for once-off events just sort of continue, and then you can run into some negative health consequences, which we're going to go into a bit more depth on later. Essentially, the imbalance between the threat and then our resources or mechanisms to cope leads to a bit of a stress response. And like I said, we'll touch on that in a moment, but Jack's going to run us through some good stresses and some bad stresses now.
Yeah, for sure. I suppose, Tom briefly mentioned the concept of it being protective, and you know, slamming brakes in the car is obviously one that we can probably all reason with at some point. But yeah, another one for me where I've certainly noticed it was when we were moving house and I was carrying a tall boy down some stairs, not by myself, but the other person helping me actually tripped on a stair, which yeah, led to that tall boy basically almost landing, I suppose, or all the weight of it going onto my back, which was pretty heavy. But the immediate, I suppose, or that acute stress response, yeah, popped in to make sure that I didn't end up being squashed. So that's just another, you know, example of how it is actually protective and out there to help us more than anything.
Yeah.
Cool. So I suppose next what we're going to touch on is the concept of stress being a good thing to start with. So this concept of eustress, it's called, is stress that I suppose is associated more with excitement than anything else. So you might be able to reason with, you know, the first time you're seeing some family for the first time in a long time, you've got some relatives from overseas or something like that coming to stay, and you're sort of a bit stressed because you want the house to be ready to make sure that it's all clean and tidy for when they get there. But obviously there's a bit of stress associated with that, but obviously it's excitement, or it might be, you know, having a child.
All around sort of positive life events, as opposed to the way we usually think of it, which is negatively.
Yeah. And then probably, I suppose, the one that Tom and I can reason with the most is getting a bit edgy before a game of sport. So whether for us it's finals for footy or for cricket,
definitely,
or, you know, down the last couple of holes when you're having a good score on the golf course. Sometimes we can, you know, get a bit edgy, get some butterflies and that kind of thing, and that's the stress response ticking in as well. Obviously, it's in a very good way. But it is still stress nonetheless. So that can actually help us. It can help us with things like motivation, can help us, you know, perceive it as something that we can cope with. So it's not overwhelming, I suppose, in that regard. It's not deemed outside our coping mechanism. And I suppose the most important thing with it is that it actually increases our capacity to perform in that sort of setting.
So context,
in a sporting context, and I suppose, you know, there's nothing like being particularly motivated when your favourite cousin from overseas is coming to stay, and you tend to be pretty productive at getting the house clean to make sure they're coming as well. So there's lots of different examples that we can use there. But yeah, that eustress or that positive stress is certainly something that that influences all. We just don't necessarily think about it all that much. So. Obviously, the other end of the coin is the concept of distress, and that's probably something that we can all, I suppose, potentially reason with quite a bit as well. And that is when, I suppose, the stress becomes associated with like fears or concerns, or that we potentially don't have the mechanisms or resources to cope with that stress. So there can often be subsequent anxiety and concern, and it feel quite unpleasant, and it can almost like decrease our performance. And then there's obviously, you know, mental and physical effects of that as well. So whether it's, you know, insecurity around your job, financial stress, you know, relationship troubles, might be a fear of flying or heights, or, you know, worrying about a presentation you've got to give. These can all, I suppose, have some more adverse effects from a stress point of view, as opposed to those good ones like we mentioned earlier.
But all, like we were saying earlier, completely normal responses to these kind of situations as well. I think that's the important thing to focus on, is that you know, these are all normal responses, and this is the way the body's supposed to respond. Where the issues arise is when it sort of prolongs for longer than, you know, whatever the event that's happening is. So if you're giving a public speaking display or something like that, you know, you're probably a bit stressed, a bit anxious beforehand, but once you've finished, it is probably going to subside. When you're in situations where that stress continues past the point where the stressor is actually present, then that's where we can run into some issues, and we'll touch on that in just a moment as well. So what actually happens inside the body when all these sort of stress responses that we're talking about has happened? So we're going to talk about, just over the next little bit, the sort of acute responses to stress from a physiological standpoint. So essentially, a lot of people have probably heard of the fight or flight response. So what this actually refers to is part of your nervous system triggers a whole bunch of different responses, essentially to prepare you to fight, as if you're about to fight off some predators, or flight, run away. So that's the way that we're sort of taught about it and we think about it. But what actually happens when this response kicks in? So things like your heart rate and blood pressure become elevated, so that your heart can pump more blood to your body, provide your body with energy. Your respiration or your breathing rate is going to go up as well, to bring in as much oxygen for that energy. There's more oxygen and blood sent to the brain. So we mentioned being alert and being focused, and obviously in a sporting context that happens as well. There's changes in your metabolism, so quicker breakdown of sugars and fats is basically so that they can be used to provide the body with energy. There's some things in the body go the opposite way, so there's less blood flow distributed to things like your digestive tract, so less focus on digesting your food, more focus on providing the energy for the body as well. And arguably most importantly, or the most sort of important thing to think about to start with, is there's an increase in the hormone called cortisol, which we did touch on a little bit when we were talking about the sleep Facebook lives. But this essentially primes the body for action, keeps us alert, and basically drives and begins the process of all of what I've just spoken about as well. So cortisol, adrenaline is probably a hormone that other people, everyone out there has probably heard of as well, and that goes up in response to some stresses as well. So this kind of situation, imagine you're, something's chasing you, or predators chasing you. Obviously, you need the quick energy and quick focus to be able to get away. So the body sees a spike in adrenaline, in cortisol, which is then going to lead to quicker breathing rate, quicker heart rate, more blood, oxygen, and energy to the tissues that need it to literally fight or flight. So it's a bit of a background on the fight or flight response, and that's what happens in the short term. And that stuff's happening when we're going to play sport, when we're going to give a public speech or something like that. When you're in an argument, all these things are happening as well. So very good in the short term, but as we're about to find out, maybe not as good in the longer term.
Yeah, for sure. I think we can all probably recall a time where we've had that feeling as well. I know we've used the example of slamming the brakes on in the car, or almost, another example is when you pop your hand on a stove that's quite hot, and you rip it off without sort of thinking too much, and that's just your fight or flight response coming in protectively.
And you probably feel like if you slam the brakes on in the car, you're sitting there and all of a sudden your heart's just racing, or you're breathing a bit quicker, and that's basically the stress response.
Yeah. So that's the protective and the really short-term phase of the stress response.
Yeah.
I suppose if you think about something though, like if Tom or I are driving home today and someone swerves in front of us and we slam on the brakes really quickly, that stress response is going to come in really quickly.
Yeah.
I would like to then hope that by the time we're sitting down in front of the football later on tonight, we're probably not so stressed about the car that swerved in front of us anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
But when we, I suppose, relate that to something like work-related stress or, financial sort of stresses, we're effectively applying that concept over and over and over again. And that's when...
And the stress is maybe not going away like it would is if you're, in a car crash or something like that.
Yeah. And that's where I suppose this concept of chronic stress comes in. And that's where, we've got the perceived stressor there, but it's not going away, and it almost seems outside our mechanisms to cope, or we seem to get over it but then it comes back again, or whatever the case is. So I suppose what tends to happen here is that once that sort of initial surge of adrenaline subsides, I suppose there's a second element of the stress response as well, and that's what's called the HPA axis. And this basically plays a role in keeping our nervous system activated so that we can continue to respond to the stressor. So that's obviously the protective side of it, to make sure that we can manage that stressor as well as possible. But again, if this just keeps happening ongoing, then that's going to have some adverse effects, which we will sort of touch on later.
Yep.
So
you don't want to be sort of wired for stress all the time.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. And the main, I suppose, element of what happens if this HPA axis is just activated the entire time is that cortisol just keeps getting released effectively. And we know that cortisol, again, can have make sure that we've got lots of energy in that way, I suppose. But if it's getting, released all the time, it can affect things like our weight, like our sleep, like our capacity to function from a neural perspective, or how we think. There's so many adverse effects of having, cortisol released for so long, and effectively when the HPA axis is just continually hyperactive, I suppose, that's what the effect of that is. And in short, there's quite a few adverse effects of that, which we're going to go and touch on a little bit now as well.
Yeah. So lots of basically chronic stress is going to impact almost all systems of the body, your brain, different organs, your emotions, the way you're thinking, the way you're feeling. So we're going to touch on a few different things and a few different, I guess, conditions or pathologies, and how stress can either make things worse or lead to changes in the body that may not be so good for you. So the first one revolves around weight gain and obesity. So Jack's just spoken about the sort of chronic elevation of cortisol, and what that can actually do in the body is lead to the accumulation of visceral or sort of fat around your midsection, visceral fat, due to poor insulin and leptin function. So they're two other hormones that do have a huge role to play in your weight, and if cortisol is active all the time, it can sort of interfere with the way that those hormones are supposed to be acting, and definitely lead to more weight gain around the midsection. So, and that's independent of what you're eating and how much you're exercising as well. If your cortisol levels are constantly elevated without much of a rest, it's like being switched on the whole time, basically. And that can then lead to weight gain, which obviously has many other risk factors as well. Chronic cortisol stimulation can lead to elevated risk of type 2 diabetes and worsening of that condition. The organs like the liver and the pancreas, which have a big role to play in managing type 2 diabetes, they're going to be affected negatively as well. And your lifestyle choices associated with stress can also contribute to weight gain. So something that a lot of people might be familiar with, and we've heard it a few times in here, stress eating, binge eating, you're too stressed to exercise, or,
don't have the motivation.
Don't have the motivation. All those kind of things play a role in, management of diabetes and weight gain and metabolic health, I guess, in total. So, all of those can be impacted by stress. You're stressed out, you're home for a big day from work, you're really stressed. I'll just grab a packet of chips and finish that. And I guess probably the decision making around there is probably not as good as it could be, but that's not necessarily a control or a personal choice. That's just your hormones suggesting some things to do. So not great outcomes from a metabolic health and weight management perspective as a result of chronic stress. That's for sure.
For sure.
Yeah.
And then I suppose there's almost a fair bit of correlation between each of the concepts that we will talk about here, because naturally we know that a lot of what Tom's just suggested as well around like lifestyle is going to have a fairly significant impact on our cardiovascular health as well. So we know that certainly in that acute stress response, like Tom touched on before, that things like our heart rate and blood pressure are going to increase. And naturally that's coming back to that protective element of it. So heart rate goes up so we can get more oxygen and blood to the working muscle so that we can fight or flight basically, or run away or combat whatever is coming at us. So, you know, there's other, I suppose, elements of that response, things like some muscles, or some, sorry, blood vessels rather, dilating, so that we're directing blood away from places that don't need it quite so much. So like your digestive tract was the example Tom used before. But again, if that's happening the whole time, if our heart rate's constantly higher, if our blood pressure's constantly higher, you know, it can lead to risks of things like hypertension. And I suppose, you know, if you think about the concept of a hose, if you've got it turned on flat out the whole way, but the water's not getting out the end, I suppose that's putting a lot of pressure on the hose. And if that's happening to our blood vessels as a result of being super stressed and being, you know, going flat out the whole time, that's obviously going to have some adverse effects.
It's going to put some stress on the actual arteries themselves.
The walls of the arteries.
That becomes a problem, especially when it's around the, you know, coronary arteries that supply the heart with blood, and that's where you can have, you know, heart attacks and even strokes if it's for the brain blood vessels, which are, that's obviously not what anyone wants, but one of the unfortunate downsides of chronic stress.
Absolutely. And we know that, like, you know, there's a lot of evidence out there to suggest that that our cholesterol levels and triglyceride levels and those kinds of things become elevated as a result of that chronic stress as well. So again, it just goes to emphasize the importance of actually managing these things so that our cardiovascular, metabolic health, weight is managed appropriately. And I suppose we veer away from those lifestyle choices like your binge eating and emotional drinking, and even things like you know, drinking alcohol and those kinds of things, which are often associated, I guess, with managing stress as well. So we want to try and, you know, err away from those things as well. So probably the another thing is now moving into how we might feel physically. So you're probably not going to notice so much, I suppose, you know, feeling stressed, and then you're not going to literally watch.
You can't tell if your blood pressure's elevated just by sitting there.
Or you're not going to watch your waist circumference expand.
Yeah, exactly.
But certainly one thing we can probably all relate with is sort of tension kind of headaches, or getting, I suppose, really feeling quite tight and whatnot in our upper back and shoulders and those kinds of areas. And also like headaches, which can be like migraines and those kinds of responses. So they're often, I suppose, very much a consequence of that chronic stress as well. So that's why for a lot of people we do, and we're going to touch more on the exercise concept in later Facebook Lives, but, you know, that's why things like your mobility can be a really good way to go to actually try and relieve some of that tension, which does build up naturally in our muscles. And effectively the reason that our muscles are tense is because they're tightening up to try and get ready to go. They're tight and contracting to be ready
that sort of fight or flight response the whole time.
They're ready to rock. So we need to try and sort of turn that off a bit, which we can do via things like mobility, which we'll touch on next week. But yeah, muscles being taut the entire time is not obviously optimal for their function as well, and that can contribute to pain as well.
So I mean, everyone's probably had tight sort of anxious muscles at some point, but we've all sort of everyone's experienced pain as well at some point in their lives. And, you know, pain is another protective response, protects us from injuries. Acute pain is a good thing because it's going to be, you know, alert us to danger. But obviously chronic pain, when that pain signal is continuing over long periods of time, that's not a great thing either. And chronic levels of high cortisol and some of the other hormones that we've mentioned can make it very hard to sort of dim down or turn off that pain signal, even when there's not actually any threat to the body. And I'm sure lots of people have experienced that in some way or another. So people that are, I guess, fearful of pain, seeking only like a physical cause and cure for the injury, there can sometimes be other factors at play, like stress levels and the way that you're thinking about your pain and your stress as well. So it's got a big role to play in that as well.
Absolutely, which is why I suppose we touch on, you know, everyone that we see here, whether they're in the groups or one-to-one appointments, we always touch on stress levels. And I think probably regardless of what they come in how they present from a physical or a health standpoint. We always touch on their stress and what might be, you know, increasing their stress, because we know that it's whether it's musculoskeletal or metabolic or cardiovascular, it's likely playing a pretty significant role in their pain or blood pressure or glucose levels, whatever the case is as well. So I suppose the other one that a lot of us can probably reason with at various times, and you know, this is one that I know I definitely get when I'm, you know, playing sport, is that when I'm next into bat, for example, I can become, I suppose, quite short of breath. Basically, or like I breathe quite rapidly. I'm a bit of a shocker like that. I do get quite nervous before I bat. I'm a bit of a nervous wreck. I have to sit by myself and be away from everyone. But you know, for people that I suppose don't have respiratory disease, like I'm quite fortunate I don't. We can sort of manage this as we go. But you know, for people that have things like, it might even be asthma, or you know, things like COPD or emphysema, if we're chronically got that shortness of breath, which can be associated with stress, you know, that can have some pretty, you know, adverse effects long term as well. You know,
absolutely,
we can develop even more respiratory, you know, conditions, like whether it's emphysema, COPD, limit our capacity to get oxygen in, limited in capacity to get oxygen out as well. When all of this is going on and we're trying to manage a stress response too, that's not all that good. So that's why you've probably heard either of us or someone else, you know, do breathing kind of techniques. And that's just to try and, you know, optimize the capacity and function of our respiratory system and our airways, so that, you know, from a respiratory standpoint, we're functioning as well as we can and trying to, I suppose, positively respond to the result of stress.
And those things that you can do, so whether it's deep breathing, meditation, we're definitely going to touch on that in future episodes of this as well. So if that's something that you do currently or you're interested in, definitely stay tuned, because there'll be more to come on that as well. Stress's impact on, we've kind of touched on a lot of how it affects your body, but obviously it affects your brain as well, because that's where everything sort of starts, is in the brain. And chronic levels of stress and high levels of cortisol actually can damage the brain at the neuronal or brain cell level, influencing their capacity to wire and fire, and therefore the body's capacity to function properly as well. So there's a little part of the brain called the hippocampus, and that becomes very sensitive to stress as a result of elevated cortisol and chronically elevated cortisol. And the high levels of cortisol can actually damage and cause those cells to die in the hippocampus and shrink in size. And obviously that's going to have a role in how that part of the brain functions, and that part of the brain has a big role to play in anxiety and depression as well. So mental health can definitely be affected. Obviously there's the anxiety of things that are stressing you, but at a, I guess, physiological and biological level, anxiety and depression can be negatively affected by stress as well. It's not just, oh, I'm stressed, I must be feeling bad. There's actually chemical processes that are going on in your brain that are part of the reason for that. So that's really, really important to know as well, and probably one of the main reasons why it's important to get your stress under control. Along the way, we've had some questions about sleep in the comments as well. So thanks everyone for commenting. And sleep, yes, it definitely has a big role to play in your stress, in managing your stress. If you're well slept, you've had a good night's sleep, you're probably less likely to have elevated cortisol throughout that day. And then conversely, if you know your cortisol levels are high and your anxiety is high, it's going to make it hard to get to sleep. So it becomes a bit of a vicious cycle in there as well. And the HPA axis, which Jack touched on before, has a significant role to play in regulating the circadian rhythm and the sleep-wake cycles. So chronic stress can lead to all kinds of, I guess, misuse of these systems and really throw off your sleep rhythms, which then unfortunately makes it, you know, harder to get to sleep, which makes you probably more stressed, and bit of a vicious cycle, which can be hard to crack. And hopefully If anyone has any questions on that kind of stuff, definitely recommend you go back and watch some of the previous videos, because I think we cover that in pretty great detail there as well.
For sure, yeah, for sure. There's, hopefully everyone has seen at some stage the lives that Tom and Dan put together on sleep. But yeah, certainly stress plays a huge role in our sleep. And again, you're probably getting a bit of background into Tom and I. As the sporty guys that we are, but the classic one for me is that if I've got a final for sport the next day, that's often when I struggle sleeping. And a couple of the I suppose, techniques around relaxation and that kind of thing, which we'll talk about in coming weeks. And I'm sure Tom has at times had to implement as well, so that we can actually get some sleep to make sure we're in the best position to perform the next day. So the other thing that stress can do, and I suppose it's the $1 million, I suppose, solution at the moment is what stress does to our immune system. And obviously, with everything going on at the moment, we all want our immune system in tip-top shape. So I suppose, chronic stress just leaves us so much more vulnerable to infection and disease in the body. So there's effectively just inflammation that's occurring physiologically. And if this happens over and over and over and over again, there's only so much that the body can respond to in terms of its natural immune response as well. So effectively, that's why we can become at risk of things like cancer and other pretty dire conditions. And that's why it's from an immune point of view, it's really, really important to manage our stress, because we want our immunity, like I said, especially at the moment, to be as good as it possibly can be as well. So
it kind of sucks at the moment that the thing that's causing stress for a lot of people is the coronavirus and everything that's out there and happening at the moment is actually what's going to reduce your immune response and probably leave you more susceptible to it as well.
For sure.
It's an unfortunate situation at the moment, but hopefully in the next couple of weeks, if we can provide everyone with maybe one or two things that might help to manage your stress and anxiety a little bit, it's going to be good for your health from an immunological standpoint as well.
For sure. For sure. And I suppose almost sort of tying in a little bit, but one that a lot of us disregard is the role that it has on our digestive system or our gastrointestinal health as well. So, the funny one is that one of the acute responses that Tom mentioned earlier was that when we are stressed, you often will feel the need not to go to the bathroom or something like that, because, as Tom mentioned, blood's directed away from things like our digestive tracts and those kinds of things. But if we're, again, chronically predisposed to these things, then there's changes in the bacteria which happens in our gut, and this can actually affect our mood, funnily enough. So that's why when people, I suppose, are chronically stressed, they can have changes in their mood. There's a brain-gut relationship connection that goes on, and that can get altered quite significantly if we're stressed chronically. The bacteria can, I suppose, overtake the concept of the nutrients being absorbed. We become not as efficient at absorbing the nutrients that we eat. Hopefully we're eating really good quality nutritional foods in times of stress as well, and moving, I suppose, away from that concept of binge eating, which we touched on, which can occur earlier, because we want to be responding to and being able to absorb as many of those good nutrients as we can. And this is something that can actually happen not as effectively when we are stressed, because the other thing is the nerves that are in our gut, they become more sensitive, and as such, food, and when we are digesting, it can move through at different rates, and that can give you symptoms like bloating and all of those other kinds of things, which we're actually going to touch on in a second as well. But certainly, from a digestive point of view, probably one that we overlook quite a lot in terms of our stress.
The research is only just sort of starting to come out about all this stuff in the last 10 years or so. So it's all quite new. The sort of gut-brain relationship, and it's definitely real. And you can sort of see how, from everything that we've just covered then, how stress can impact at all different levels of your health, which then, if it's going to impact your digestive health and your brain health, that's going to mean, you're making poorer decisions around your diet and your sleep, which is going to lead to weight and metabolic issues, which then feedback on the other issues. So it can definitely be a bit of a vicious cycle it's hard to escape from, and hopefully the next couple of sessions that we're running on this topic will give you some ideas of ways that you can potentially help out in that front as well.
Yeah, we've just seen a few comments which sort of makes it sound like it's all bad news around stress, but yeah, today is probably one of those ones where it's the most content heavy in terms of, I suppose, how we physiologically respond to stress. But in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be touching on all the different things that we can actually do to manage this. And there are quite a lot, we've already discussed briefly exercise, meditation, breathing techniques, and there's sort of countless things that we can actually do to manage our stress. So certainly don't think it's all bad news. There's lots that we can do. And I suppose that's what we're going to be going over in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, cool. Before we finish up, we thought we'd run just through some symptoms of chronic stress. So if you are worried about this yourself, you can maybe identify some of these, and whether it's talk to us here or your doctor or GP or anything like that, or even just family and friends is probably a good thing as well. So there's cognitive effects, so worsening of memory, judgment, difficulty concentrating, always seeing the negative side of things, and constant sort of worrying as well.
Yeah, being pretty pessimistic, and instead of having a positive outlook in how you can manage the stressful event that's in front of you, you just sort of see the negative side of it. I've got too much work to do. I'm not in a position to perform in this game of sport, whatever the case is. It's too painful. I can't do anything about it. So that's certainly one way we can respond cognitively. And then from an emotional level as well, we touched on before, symptoms of depression and anxiety, being quite moody, being very agitated and fidgety, or feeling overwhelmed, getting angry can sometimes be a side effect of that as well. So certainly on the whole, and it can make you potentially not the nicest people to be around.
Feel pretty average as well.
And probably I know that my family at various times when I've been a bit uneasy about game of sport, or I know back when I was studying a big final exam and that kind of thing, I potentially wasn't the most pleasant person to be around. So thankfully, hopefully they think I'm a little bit nicer now.
Or coming home from a long day at work, and you just haven't left the issues with regards to stress at work, and that can manifest coming home in being moody at home and stuff like that. There's also physical symptoms. So we spoke about pain earlier, feelings of nausea, dizziness, rapid heart rate and breathing rate, shaking, tremors, fatigue, loss of sex drive, and even frequent cold symptoms as well is sometimes a good indicator. I guess that touches on the immune response as well.
For sure. And then obviously, we've already mentioned the behavioural things that we can often do as a result. So sometimes people lose their appetite. Some people eat emotionally and eat in very high volumes. So things like binge eating, binge drinking. Our sleep obviously tends to take a bit of a hit when we're stressed. We sort of, I suppose, a lot of the time remove ourselves socially as well. So when you're in that, I just want to be alone kind of mindset, as a result of for us, it might be a massively long day at work. Don't get me wrong, we both love what we do. And then other sort of nervous habits that can often sort of creep in as well. So it might be fidgeting with your hands. It might be, always, moving your neck around, whatever the case is. Other sort of fidgety kind of things which can occur as well. And other nervous habits can be things like smoking, and even those kinds of things which are often associated with stress too. So again, hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight into what the future Facebook Lives will be around, because obviously they're things that we can very much control, things like binge eating and sleep hygiene, and other elements of our lifestyle that we can control ourselves to make sure that we're managing our stress as well as we can.
Cool.
Cool. So that's for today. That's everything that we wanted to get through today. So I hope you feel like you've got a little bit out of that and learned a little bit more about what the physiological response to stress is. It is obviously quite there's quite a lot that happens, even though at times it can happen rapidly and really quickly. there's a lot that goes on physiologically, and it's important to be aware of that. And hopefully it's motivated you to make sure that when you are in a time of stress, that you take control of it the way you can, and make sure that you are doing the right things for your overall health, and not just managing that one stressful event in your life.
Yeah, sure. So over the next couple of weeks, we're gonna, I think next week, touch on almost exclusively exercise and the role that exercise plays on stress management. And then in the coming weeks as well, other lifestyle factors that you can implement to manage stress a little bit better as well. So thanks for tuning in today. Hope everyone got a little bit out of it, and obviously watching it back on delay, you're welcome to do that as well. And I guess we'll
see you
catch
all
you next week,
either in the clinic or I think 1 o'clock next week.
Yeah, if anyone's got any questions about any of this content as well, feel free to come and talk to any one of us if you're in the clinic. Send in an email, comment on the video as well, and we'll try and cover them as much as we can in the next few videos as well.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. Have a great weekend.
See you all. Bye.